A century ago, scientists believed that this landmass known as Beringia connected eastern Siberia to Alaska. They thought it may have been a land bridge that humans used to migrate from Asia into North America some 15,000 years ago. Humans were able to walk from Siberia to Alaska at the peak of the last ice age, when Beringia was covered in thick ice sheets. Step by step, they moved into a new world, North America, vast, wild, and untouched. Their goal, the rich hunting grounds. To the south, there were no roads, no maps, only the instincts that had guided our species out of Africa and across the continents. Days turned into weeks as they walked through an alien landscape. Ancient bison with massive horns and shaggy manes roamed the plains. And then there were the mastodons, plant-eating behemoths with 6-foot-long tusks. And those brains were capable of planning, strategy, and most importantly, innovation. Our ancestors were the Clovis culture, so named because of the distinctive points they used to hunt. And boy, were those points deadly. These creatures were the lords of the plains, but they had one fatal flaw: their immense size. They traveled light, carrying only what they could with them as they followed the herds. The Clovis emerged from their shelters to a world transformed. The snow had stopped, but the temperature remained low. The ground was hard-packed ice, and the wind still carried a bite. But in the distance, the Clovis saw something that gave them hope: the return of the birds. Their weapons were their most prized possession, expertly crafted spears with razor-sharp points. The birds knew something the Clovis didn't, that the storm was coming, and if the birds didn't show up, then food would be scarce. The temperatures dropped and the forests shrank, revealing the rolling grasslands of the Great Plains. Once more, they had spread across the continent and developed many different cultures. But all of them shared one thing in common: their distinctive spear points. The herds returned, and with them the Clovis way of life. Each one was carefully crafted from stone, wood, or bone, and each one was unique. The Clovis used these points to hunt a variety of animals, from small game to large mammals, and they were so skilled at what they did that they could take down an animal with a single throw. They respected the animals they hunted and used every part of their body. Well, that's a question that has puzzled scientists for decades. Some believe that the Clovis were wiped out by a sudden climate change or a natural disaster. Others believe that they were killed by diseases brought over from Europe. Still, others believe that the Clovis were simply absorbed into other cultures and their way of life gradually disappeared. They also took only what they needed and left plenty of animals for the future. In fact, the Clovis were so successful at hunting that they were able to maintain healthy populations of all the animals they hunted. This is a remarkable achievement considering that they were living in a time when humans were just beginning to explore North America, and there were no laws or regulations governing hunting. The animals were getting bigger, the herds were growing thicker, and the weather was becoming milder. The Great Plains had changed, and the Clovis had to change with them. They created beautiful pieces of art that depicted the animals they hunted and the scenes from their everyday lives. They also told stories around the campfire that passed down their knowledge and culture to the next generation. But now the birds were back, and that meant only one thing: the end of the blizzard. One of the most famous examples is the Clovis culture's projectile points. These are small, sharp-edged pieces of stone that were attached to spears or arrows and used for hunting. Clovis culture projectile points are some of the oldest and most sophisticated stone tools ever found in North America, and they represent a major technological advancement over the simple tools used by earlier cultures. This huge, furry creature resembled a giant monkey and was one of the mainstays of the late Pleistocene. But the Clovis didn't care about its size or ferocity. They hunted the ground sloth for its meat and fur, and they were successful. The Clovis cheered and set about the task of rebuilding their lives. They gathered the remains of their shelters, salvaged what little food they could find, and set off in search of new hunting grounds. The forests were full of deer, elk, and bison, and the rivers were stocked with fish. The Clovis adapted quickly, learning to hunt new animals with new weapons. They also developed new tools for processing fish and plants, and they began to gather wild rice along the riverbanks. When a woolly mammoth or a mastodon fell, the Clovis feasted like kings. The herds had been thinned by the winter, but new life was already beginning to appear. The cycle of life and death continued on the Great Plains, and the Clovis were there to take advantage of it. The meat was so plentiful they could feed their entire tribe and even trade with other groups. The Clovis knew they had to follow if they were to continue their traditional way of life. So they packed up their belongings and set off northward into the unknown. The bones and hides were used to build shelters, and the excess meat was carefully dried and stored for the winter. They had learned to adapt to the environment, and they had developed new technologies that helped them survive. But now the environment was changing, and the Clovis had to adapt again. Life was good on the Great Plains. The Clovis had found a way to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The cold wind whipping across the plains was a constant reminder that time was running out. They needed shelter from the elements, and soon, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the temperature plummeted. The winds howled across the plains, carrying with them the icy breath of the north. It was a blizzard, the likes of which the Clovis had never seen. So let us go back to the height of the last ice age and explore the amazing story of the first Americans. The cold seeped into their bones and the hunger gnawed at their bellies. Food was scarce, and the mammoth bones that had provided warmth were nearly depleted. The Clovis huddled together for warmth, sharing stories and jokes to keep their spirits up. But even their indomitable spirits were beginning to flag. Would they make it through the winter? Only time would tell. But what they found there changed their lives forever. A valley cloaked in grasses and dotted with the bones of giants. Our ancestors had discovered the Great Plains, a place where humans had never set foot before. Here, herds of enormous mammals grazed on the short grasses, completely unaware of the danger that lurked nearby. For decades, researchers debated whether or not people arrived in North America via this supposed land bridge or by boat along the coast. And if they came by foot, did they cross the frozen tundra during the last ice age? Following closely behind were others, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands. All of them were searching for the same thing, food, and the Great Plains offered plenty of it. Or did they arrive after the climate warmed up and forests replaced the grasslands? Thanks to modern science, we now know the definitive answer. The world was locked in ice. But across the frigid expanse of Beringia, the first Americans came. As the ice sheet stretched out around them, our ancestors continued on foot. Then they saw it, a rise in the land that could give them the protection they needed, and our ancestors were hungry. The journey had been long and the cold was relentless, but they weren't alone. Among the giants were woolly mammoths, with thick coats of hair and tusks like curved swords. See, our ancestors were small, just 4 feet tall on average. But they had something the giants didn't. The Clovis were nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived in small groups. But they were about to face their greatest challenge yet, a brutal winter that would test their skills and determination like never before. For days, the snow fell relentlessly, piling up against their shelters and burying the landscape. As the sun finally began to climb back into the sky, the blizzard began to subside. Each day that passed without a single bird sighting was a bad omen. As the days grew longer and the weather warmer, the Clovis found plenty of game. But as the years passed, the Clovis noticed something strange. At this point, the Clovis had been living on the Great Plains for several hundred years. The climate was warming, the forests were growing, and the herds were moving farther north. As the Clovis traveled northward, they encountered new plants and animals. But as the centuries passed, the climate began to change once again. By this point, the Clovis had been in North America for over 10,000 years. These spear points were not just tools, they were works of art. In fact, the Clovis were so skilled that they were able to hunt some animals that had never been hunted before, like the giant ground sloth. The Clovis were not just hunters, they were toolmakers, artists, and storytellers. In fact, the Clovis were so advanced that they were able to develop new technologies that had never been seen before in North America. The Clovists were a peaceful people who lived in harmony with nature. So what happened to the Clovis culture? Why are they no longer with us today? What do you think happened to the Clovis? Let me know in the comments below. Now check out another video on the mysterious Native American cave paintings decoded, or click this other video instead.
The story of the Clovis culture, first Americans of the Stone Age. Scene 1, Ice and Migration. There are no borders on this map where North America and Asia meet. It's all connected. There are only white expanses stretching from horizon to horizon, broken only by a few lonely trees. But around 14,000 years ago, the ice sheet covering it began to recede. And as the glaciers melted away, so did the bridge between Siberia and North America. An entire continent disappeared beneath the waves, taking with it the indigenous people who'd inhabited it. Some drowned, others froze to death, but a lucky few survived. These are their descendants. And their story is America's story. Another group of people later arrived in North America from the south. But before we get to that, let's go back to the beginning. The sun is barely up when two groups of people arrive. In front of you, the water stretches to the horizon. Behind you, you can see the Siberian coast. Between you and Siberia, nothing. Just water. What do? Do you jump in and swim to Siberia, or do you head south along the coast? And as the glaciers in the north continued to melt, the sea level rose, eventually flooding the Bering Land Bridge once and for all. They followed the herds of animals that they depended on for food and shelter, and they rarely stayed in one place for more than a few months at a time. They developed new weapons and techniques for hunting large game, such as the atlatl, a simple tool that allowed them to throw their spears more accurately and with more force. They also hunted smaller animals, such as rabbits and deer, and gathered wild plants, nuts, and berries. They were not a monolithic group, but rather a collection of different cultures and ethnicities. They were able to survive the long and arduous journey across the Bering Land Bridge. Until next time, keep learning and stay curious. They adapted to a new and challenging environment, and they built thriving cultures despite the odds. They were the pioneers of a new world, and their legacy lives on in the rich tapestry of Native American cultures that have since flourished across the continent. They spoke different languages, had different customs and beliefs, and came from different genetic backgrounds. Despite their differences, they were all united by their common goal of survival in a new and challenging environment. They were experts at surviving in the wilderness. They knew how to build fires, find water, and protect themselves from the elements. They also had a deep knowledge of the natural world and the animals that inhabited it. This knowledge allowed them to thrive in some of the harshest environments on Earth. They made their homes in caves or under the shelter of large rocks. When they weren't traveling, they spent their time hunting, gathering food, and making tools. They lived a simple life, but it was a hard one. By 8000 BC, the continent of Beringia was gone. Those who had crossed the bridge early enough would never see their homeland again. They developed new tools and technologies, created art, and developed complex social structures. They also interacted with other cultures, both peacefully and violently. As the centuries passed, these small bands of nomadic hunters became the ancestors of the great civilizations that would one day flourish across the continent. Those who hadn't crossed yet were cut off from the rest of the world forever. They were now truly on their own. For the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge 14,000 years ago, this was exactly the choice they faced. Most headed south. They followed the coast until they reached the southern tip of the Alaskan Peninsula. Then they turned east and began to follow the coastline. They traveled across that featureless white void with little more than the clothes on their backs and the spears in their hands. But eventually, after months of travel, they arrived at a new land. The Colorado River cut through the region like a scar, carving deep canyons into the rock. Towering cliffs rose up out of the desert floor, hiding ancient ruins from view. Small bands of nomadic hunter-gatherers lived in this harsh environment, eking out a living by hunting wild game and gathering wild plants. They were the ancestors of the modern Native Americans. They were the first humans to set foot here in thousands of years. It was a vast, wild, and largely empty place. The climate was warmer than they were used to, and there was an abundance of wild game. But there was also danger. New predators roamed the land, such as dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, and short-faced bears. As the centuries passed, small groups of people spread throughout the continent, each adapting to the unique challenges of their environment. Some learned to hunt the giant bison that roamed the Great Plains. Others developed new tools and techniques for hunting smaller game. Still, others moved to the coast and learned to fish. They don't know what lies ahead, but they have no choice but to find out. The world was locked in ice. But across the frigid expanse of Beringia, the first Americans came. Step by step, they moved into a new world, North America, vast, wild, and untouched. For thousands of years, these two land masses had been joined, forming a massive continent called Beringia. Hello and welcome to Paleologic. Today we're going to talk about the first Americans. Let's get into it. 14,000 years ago, the Earth was still emerging from the last ice age. Much of the planet was still covered in thick sheets of ice. That included the top of North America, which was buried beneath thousands of feet of ice. Even today, there are patches of ice left over from the last ice age, in northern Canada, Greenland, and Siberia. But back then there were many more, and they were far more extensive. One of those ice caps lay over the Bering Land Bridge, which connected Siberia and North America. It's here that our story begins. The Bering Land Bridge had formed during the last ice age when the sea level was low enough for the two continents to be connected. Because of this connection, people had migrated back and forth between the two land masses for thousands of years. The oldest evidence of people in North America comes from this period. For example, the Clovis culture, named after the site where their distinctive spear points were first discovered, is associated with the oldest well-established sites of human habitation in North America. The Clovis culture thrived across much of the continent from around 13,000 to 12,800 years ago. However, recent finds such as the pre-Clovis site of Monteverde in Chile suggest that humans may have arrived in South America at least 14,500 years ago. This would put the beginnings of human migration to the Americas at roughly the same time as the first people arrived in Europe, marking an end to the long hiatus in the human fossil record after the Neanderthals went extinct. But this wasn't the only migration into the Americas. Imagine you're standing on the shores of the Bering Sea. It was a perilous journey. Along the way, they had to brave raging storms, fight off dangerous animals, and scavenge whatever food they could find. Today, this area is known as the American Southwest. But 14,000 years ago, it looked very different. When the first Americans arrived, they encountered a world unlike any they'd ever seen before. But life was not easy. Natural disasters such as floods and droughts were common. For the most part, the first Americans lived in small nomadic bands. These early Americans were highly skilled hunters. Despite the challenges they faced, these early Americans were able to build thriving cultures. The first Americans were a diverse group of people who came from many different parts of the world. In the end, the first Americans were a resilient and adaptable people. Thank you for joining me today as we explore the fascinating history of the first Americans. The Clovis culture. Meet the first Americans from the Stone Age, shaping history. Scene 2, Hunters and Giants. All across America there's a landscape filled with bones. In the Great Plains, beneath the ground, there are skeletons of some of Earth's biggest mammals. And in these bones, scientists have found evidence of the world's first super hunters. These people are called the Clovis culture. The wind whips through the tall grasses as the mammoths lumber past in the distance. One of the hunters raises his spear. Points glint in the morning sun. Another hunter knocks an arrow to his bow. The herd thunders past. Spears flash, and one of the mammoths falls to the ground with a spear protruding from its side. The herd stampede. The Clovis gather around the fallen mammoth, cheering in their ancient tongue. Slow motion shows a Clovis point hitting its target, embedding itself in the shoulder of a mammoth. The camera pans up to show the mammoth shaking its head in pain as it looks back at the hunters. Close-ups of tools being worked by a skilled artisan. The process of creating a spear point from a chunk of stone. Working with chert, obsidian, bone, and antler, they created spear points, knives, and other tools perfectly suited for hunting big game. And these tools would have been essential for survival. Another craftsman carefully works on a bone tool while lying on the ground next to a fire. The men hunted mammoths while the women processed the meat. But that wasn't all they ate. The Clovis were opportunistic hunters. They dined on bison, deer, camels, horses, and anything else that crossed their path. Most of what we know comes from the material remains found at archaeological sites, such as this one. We know they were skilled hunters and that they traveled extensively. But beyond that, there's a lot that we don't understand about their society, their culture, and their language. Some archaeologists even think they hunted early humans. For example, the Clovis culture thrived from about 13,500 to 12,800 years ago. But just before and after that time, archaeologists have found evidence of human activity across the continent, from the pre-Clovis culture of the American Southeast to the post-Clovis culture of the Arctic. First, there's the Younger Dryas impact theory, which proposes that comet fragments struck the Earth, causing massive wildfires, destroying Clovis settlements and killing countless animals. But not all scientists agree. In fact, some argue that these impacts didn't happen at all. They say that the Younger Dryas was a natural climate fluctuation that caused the megafauna to go extinct. Were these items placed in the graves for use in the afterlife, or were they simply lost or discarded nearby during the burial? Unfortunately, we don't know. Visuals end. Until next time, remember, keep an open mind, ask questions, and never stop exploring. He dips the point in a bucket of water and takes it out to dry. In the background, we see footage of the archaeological sites that have revealed the secrets of the Clovis culture. Archaeologists carefully brush dirt off of an arrowhead that they've just discovered. Close-up of an arrowhead. The legacy of the Clovis lives on today in the traditions of Native Americans across the continent. Many tribes tell stories of great hunts featuring mammoths and other Ice Age creatures. And some still practice the ancient art of making stone tools, just as the Clovis did 10,000 years ago. Visuals end. It lets out a trumpeting call before falling to the ground. but their influence lived on in the oral histories and rock art of later cultures. For thousands of years, the descendants of the Clovis would tell stories of their ancestors' bravery in hunting mammoths and other wild beasts. Theirs was a proud legacy, one that would endure for millennia. A boy lies buried with several spears and knives. His arms are crossed over his chest. These magnificent animals included the woolly mammoth, the giant ground sloth, the saber-toothed cat, and many others. Together, they formed the megafauna of the Pleistocene epoch, which thrived across North America until about 11,500 years ago, when nearly all of them went extinct. Next to him is the skeleton of a woman who appears to be lying on her side. She has an arrowhead embedded in her skull. Close-up of an arrowhead. The Clovis buried their dead with ceremony, often placing valuable items in the graves. But why did they bury the woman with the arrowhead still in her skull? Was she a warrior? Did she die in battle? What was life like for the women of the Clovis culture? These questions remain unanswered, but the discovery of this grave raises more questions than it does answers. Visuals end. They lived 13,000 years ago, and for at least 600 years, they stalked some of the largest animals that ever lived. With sharp minds and sharper weapons, they hunted with precision and courage. Scene 2, Hunters and Giants visuals. A group of Clovis hunters, wearing cloaks made of animal skins, stalk a migrating herd of woolly mammoths. Narration: they faced giants, woolly mammoths, ancient bison, towering mastodons. But the Clovis were not helpless. Mammoth herds would migrate across the continent following the seasons. And the Clovis followed the herds, living off the land. Hi everyone, welcome to this channel. Clovis is the name given to a culture that thrived in North America during the late Pleistocene epoch. The Clovis culture is named after the type site where artifacts were first discovered, which is in New Mexico, between about 13,500 and 12,800 years ago. Members of this culture made their homes wherever the mammoths roamed, from Alaska to Arizona, Washington to Wisconsin. During the Pleistocene, most of North America was covered in grassland, much like today. Scene 3, Folsom visuals. An artist rendering of the construction of a Folsom toolkit. Narration: at each stop along the way, the Clovis built camps and crafted new tools. The mammoth was the center of the Clovis diet. Every part of the animal was used: meat for food, fat for fuel, bones for tools, and hides for shelter. Scene 4, Burials visuals. Archaeologists uncovering burial grounds containing the skeleton of a man, woman, and child. Narration: across the graves, archaeologists found flint and bone tools, including several finished and unfinished spear points, as well as a quantity of debitage, which is the small flakes of rock that are produced when knapping stone tools. In fact, there's a lot that we do and know about the Clovis, because they left behind very little in the way of records. We also don't know if they were one society or many societies that shared similar traits. Scene 5, Legacy. Visuals: a modern-day Lakota Sioux crafts an arrowhead while sitting next to a campfire. Narration: as the Ice Age gave way to the Holocene, the megafauna went extinct and the Clovis disappeared. It's hard to believe that our world once teemed with giant mammals, creatures so huge that they dwarfed anything alive today. But how did this mass extinction occur? There are many theories, but two stand out. What do you think? How did the mammoths and mastodons disappear? Let us know in the comments below. And thank you for joining us on this journey back in time. The story of the Clovis culture, first Americans of the Stone Age. Scene 3, The Toolmakers. The first Americans didn't just stumble onto the continent. They brought technology with them that would influence cultures for thousands of years. This is the third episode in our series on the prehistory of North America and what eventually happened to them. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the archaeology of the Clovis culture, the oldest widely accepted culture in North America. In the last two episodes, we looked at the evidence for people crossing into North America via the Bering Land Bridge during the last Ice Age, and there are many more sites like this where archaeologists have found butchered animal bones. Using stone tools like these takes a great deal of patience and skill. There are lots of theories, but the reality is that after 10,000 years, Almost everything that might have told us what happened to the Clovis people has been lost to time. Proposed by physicist Richard Firestone and his colleagues, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis argues that the Clovis culture wasn't replaced. It was wiped out by a massive comet shower. Over the next 6,000 years, they slowly developed new technologies and new ways of surviving in a rapidly changing world. Eventually, around 500 years ago, those descendants would develop the magnificent cultures that European explorers would encounter when they arrived in the 16th century. According to the theory, the impact of comets caused massive wildfires and disrupted the climate, destroying the Clovis way of life. To learn more about them, check out the resources in the description below. A special thanks to our supporters whose names you can see on screen right now. If you'd like to see your name on the screen and contribute to the production of these videos, join our membership program today. I'll see you next time. Evidence for this theory includes unusually high levels of radioactive isotopes in sediment layers dating to 12,900 years ago. Scientists believe that this spike may have come from a nearby supernova, an exploding star that sent cosmic debris raining down on Earth. There are also microscopic diamonds found in the same layer of sediment that could have formed only under extreme heat and pressure, perhaps from a comet's impact with Earth. Of course, proving that a comet really did wipe out the Clovis culture is very difficult. But if it's true, then there must be physical evidence left behind. Unfortunately, thus far, none of the proposed evidence has panned out. There are some gaps in the archaeological record that coincide with the Younger Dryas, but they aren't unique to it. Also, the Clovis culture thrived for thousands of years after the proposed impact event, suggesting that whatever happened, it didn't happen all at once. Still, the possibility that the Clovis people were wiped out by a comet or meteor shower is an exciting idea. But whether or not it's true, it doesn't change the fact that their disappearance marked a turning point in North American prehistory. So archaeologists are left with nothing but scraps of evidence to try and piece together the mystery. What we do know is that around 12,000 years ago, the climate began to warm. As the ice melted, sea levels rose, which flooded coastal areas and cut off many populations from the sea. At the same time, the warmer temperatures led to a whole new set of plants and animals moving into newly habitable areas. And suddenly the huge woolly mammoths and mastodons that the Clovis people had relied on for food disappeared. Unable to adapt to these rapid changes, the Clovis culture collapsed. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe they did adapt, but simply left behind no trace of their new ways of life. Unfortunately, without written history, we can't know for sure what happened to the Clovis people. And that same patience and skill shows up in the way the Clovis people hunted and gathered. Take the site of Mastodon State Historic Park in Colorado. Here, archaeologists found the remains of a Columbian mammoth and clear evidence that the Clovis people had taken every bit of meat off its bones. The ribs, the vertebrae, even the skull, all show signs of butchery. At the site of Jones Ranch in Texas, archaeologists found the butchered remains of 18 prehistoric animals. The animals included North American camels, horses, and bison. Taken together, these findings tell us that the Clovis people were successful hunters. They were able to hunt large game and take it down with the incredibly well-crafted darts and spears tipped with obsidian blades, but they were also opportunistic. When smaller prey was available, they hunted it too. For example, at the Leonard Creek site in Kentucky, archaeologists found evidence that the Clovis people hunted small animals like rabbits and squirrels. Some of the rabbit bones even showed signs of being cracked open to extract the nutritious brain. So the Clovis culture wasn't just made of nomadic hunters following herds across the plains. They were flexible, changing their diet based on what was available. And that adaptability would help them thrive across such a large area. It was expertly crafted from a high-quality source of flint and had been carefully notched at one end and then flaked to a razor-sharp edge. One of the amazing things about the Clovis culture is that they were able to spread so far and wide, reaching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Circle, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific Northwest. But as far as archaeologists can tell, they only lasted a couple hundred years, maybe even less. This is a big part of what makes the Clovis culture so fascinating. It raises questions like why did they disappear, what happened to them, and how does that relate to later Native American cultures? Each Clovis point was a masterpiece. Fluted, balanced, deadly. These were more than weapons, they were a technology ahead of their time, spreading across a continent. All across North America, there are small clusters of rocks with flakes missing from them, the leftover cores from which Clovis points were made. These cores were struck repeatedly, patiently chipped away until the best angle was achieved. The finished product, perfectly symmetrical, exquisitely crafted, an example of the human mind working through trial and error, creating a masterpiece of efficiency. Each fluted point could be used to tip several arrows or spears before being too worn down to continue its service. With this technology, the people who wielded them would have been adept hunters. Its distinctive shape made it stand out from other projectile points found at the site. Archaeologists named it the Clovis Point. Since then, more than 30,000 Clovis points have been discovered all over North America. They range from Maine to Arizona and south into Mexico. And they've been found at hundreds of sites from Florida to the Great Lakes. That's a lot of data to work with, which has allowed archaeologists to reconstruct one of the first pictures of life for early Americans. We also explored the idea of another migration across the Pacific from Japan. If you haven't seen those episodes yet, check them out. But if you have, there are still some pretty big holes in our understanding of how people first got to the Americas. One of those holes is what happened to the earliest Americans once they arrived here. How did they survive? What kind of tools did they use? In 1932, archaeologists found a spear point in the Blackwater River in New Mexico. What's most remarkable about these points is the incredible skill it took to make them. But that's not all they were doing. Across North America, there are dozens of sites where archaeologists have uncovered remnants of meals eaten by Clovis people. But how long did they thrive for? Unfortunately, the truth is we don't know the answers to these questions. And that's a big reason why the theory of the Younger Dryas impact event is so compelling. After the Clovis culture vanished, small groups of people spread out across the continent. I hope you enjoyed this episode on the Clovis culture. The Clovis culture, the first Americans of the Stone Age. Episode 4, Daily Life in Motion. A cold wind sweeps across the Great Plains, whipping the tall grasses into a frenzy. 2 bison skulls lie abandoned on the ground, picked clean by scavengers. In the distance, a lone wolf howls. Today we're going to explore what life was like for the indigenous tribes that once roamed these lands. The sun climbed higher in the sky, the men set off to hunt. The women and children stayed behind to prepare hides, mend equipment, and care for the camp. The men would return with meat for the women and children. Some of the meat was dried and preserved for the winter months. Children play with bone toys. Women prepare hides. Hunters return from the plains. People are moving constantly. Their lives are in motion. They travel in bands, small and mobile. Their villages are not permanent. They move from place to place following the herds. They were spiritual people, connected to the earth and the animals around them. They believed that everything was sacred and should be respected. The men were responsible for hunting bison and protecting the tribe. They would set out in the morning and return in the evening with the meat and hides. The women were responsible for processing the hides and preparing the food. They would also gather berries and other plants for food. The children were responsible for taking care of the younger siblings and helping out around camp. Life was hard, but the tribes were strong and united. They had to be. In order to survive on the Great Plains, they had to be able to adapt to the changing seasons and the challenges that came with them. They had to be able to hunt and gather food, build shelter, and protect themselves from the elements and from other tribes. They did all of these things and more. And they did it with grace, dignity, and respect for the land and each other. They had a deep knowledge of the natural world and used it to their advantage. They are still connected to the land and to each other. They are still strong, resilient, and proud. They were patient, resourceful, and never gave up. They were strong, brave, and united. We hope you learned something new and gained a deeper appreciation for the indigenous tribes of the Great Plains. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an adventure. Until next time, happy exploring. Life was harsh but full of rhythm. Hunt, move, rest, repeat. They knew the land, they respected it, they survived it. First there are the bison skulls. These were more than just trophies. They were a symbol of power and strength. The skulls were often decorated with paint or feathers and hung from lodges or carried on raids. They were also used in ceremonies to represent the bison spirit. Then there are the arrowheads. These were made from flint or obsidian and were used for hunting bison and other animals. They were incredibly sharp and could pierce the thick hide of a bison. The arrowheads were also used in warfare, but the tribes preferred to avoid battle if possible. Finally, there are the hides. These were used for clothing, shelter, and blankets. The hides had to be processed carefully to prevent them from spoiling. Once they were ready, they were cut and sewn together using an awl and sinew. The hides were also decorated with paint or beads to show the wearer's status or achievements. The rest of the meat was shared with the other members of the tribe. They are talking, laughing, and telling stories. The flames crackle and pop, casting dancing shadows on the faces of the people. The stars shine brightly in the night sky above them. They are safe here, surrounded by their loved ones. The men tell stories of the hunt, of bravery and cunning. The women listen, their eyes shining with admiration. The children snuggle close to their parents, soaking up the warmth of the fire and the love of their family. This is their life. This is who they are. Bison provided all of their needs: food, clothing, shelter, and tools. Every part of the bison was used. Nothing was wasted. Their survival depended on the bison. From hunting bison to preparing hides and caring for children, these tribes were experts at surviving in the wild. Let's jump in. She works quickly, scraping away the excess fat and flesh. Her hands are calloused, her movements precise. They are making clicking sounds and moving a small piece of bone back and forth between them. The piece of bone has been shaped into a bird, and the children are imitating its movements. The flickering firelight dances in their eyes, their faces lit with joy and wonder. The children play while the adults work. They have time to be kids. The older children help the adults with their tasks. They don't have time to be bored. There are always things that need to be done. But they also know how to have fun. They make toys out of bones and play games that help them learn about the world around them. They have a strong sense of community and take pride in their culture. The children are the future of their tribe, and they are learning everything they need to know to survive. Her daughter watches, eager to learn. Another woman cuts strips of hide into smaller pieces for weaving. Yet another woman uses a stone tool to punch holes along the edge of a hide. Each hole is perfectly round, uniform, and spaced evenly apart. These hides will become clothing, blankets, and shelter. Their lives revolved around the hides. It took many hours to prepare a single hide for use. They used every part of the animal they hunted. Nothing went to waste. The hides had to be processed quickly before they spoiled. The women worked together to get them done on time. They lived in harmony with nature, taking only what they needed and giving back what they could. Let's take a closer look at some of the tools they used. Now let's talk about the daily life of the tribes. Today, the indigenous tribes of the Great Plains are still thriving. Thanks for joining us on this journey through time. The story of the Clovis culture, first Americans of the Stone Age. Episode 5. Disappearance and Mysteria for thousands of years. Before European colonization, over 30 million people thrived in North America for thousands of years. They hunted megafauna, built impressive earthworks, and developed complex societies, all before Europeans arrived and nearly wiped them out. Today we're going to look at the Clovis culture, one of the most widespread and longest-lasting pre-Columbian cultures in North America. At its peak around 12,800 years ago, this culture stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, encompassing many different groups of people. And while each group had its own language and customs, they all shared similar technology and lifestyle. And lasted so long, the Clovis points are like a common thread weaving together dozens of disparate cultures and time periods. In fact, for decades, Archaeologists believe that everyone who lived within the Clovis culture was part of the same group of people. That was partly because they thought that this culture only lasted for a few hundred years during the late Pleistocene epoch, right before the end of the last ice age. For example, at Blackwater Draw in New Mexico, researchers found the bones of 42 mammoths butchered and discarded by Clovis people. Instead, they turned to smaller animals like deer and bison. But there's a problem with that because we also see that these smaller animals were less rewarding to hunt. Did the extinction of the megafauna cause the collapse of the Clovis culture, or did something else play a role? And where did all the people go? We've considered all kinds of theories from drought and famine to warfare and disease, but nothing seems to fit all the evidence. But while it's true that droughts may have contributed to the megafauna extinction, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Clovis culture collapsed because of it. Humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, and we've survived everything from tsunamis to volcanoes to nuclear bombs. There's no reason to think that a little old drought would wipe us out. Imagine you're a hunter-gatherer living in a semi-arid environment. Climate change is already causing rising sea levels, melting glaciers, extreme weather, and a host of other changes. And while we can't turn back the clock, we can still go down a different path. If you want to harvest the meat of a white-tailed deer, you can only get about 20 pounds of meat per hour of work. On the other hand, if you hunt a bison, you can get 70 pounds of meat per hour of work. But if you hunt a woolly mammoth, you can get 350 pounds of meat per hour of work. Woolly mammoth meat was about 17 times richer in protein than beef and contained almost twice as much fat. To make things even better, mammoths were much easier to hunt than bison since their slow metabolisms meant that they needed to eat almost constantly. In other words, hunting mammoths was easy and rewarding, which is probably why every single Clovis group we know of went mammoth crazy. The kill site dates back 13,500 years and includes one of the deepest Clovis projectile point cuts ever found. That's pretty deep. Some groups moved to new environments, while others experimented with new foods, technologies, and social systems. Over time, they evolved into the cultures we associate with the Archaic period in North American prehistory. But others didn't adapt so easily. And eventually, they too disappeared, leaving behind a mystery that continues to intrigue archaeologists to this day. But what's even deeper is that above the kill site, there's another layer of sediment dating to 13,100 years ago with no signs of animal bones or human occupation. Basically, one day there's a giant kill site with mammoth bones and the next there isn't. But we have to remember that the megafauna extinction was a gradual process that happened over hundreds of years. It wasn't like one day there were mammoths everywhere and the next day there were none. Instead, the changing environment gradually pushed the megafauna to extinction. And the Clovis people had time to respond, time to develop new hunting strategies, new technologies, and new lifeways. Yes, mammoths disappeared, and yes, they were an important food source, but there's no reason to think that the Clovis culture couldn't have adapted to their loss. But more recent research suggests that the Clovis culture lasted much longer, appearing as early as 13,600 years ago, and continuing until around 12,000 years ago. This means that Clovis lasted through the end of the Ice Age and into the Holocene epoch when the climate started warming and the world began to look more like it does today. They were big-game hunters who traveled in small groups and subsisted on the meat of mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths. After all, humans had survived one of the most dramatic shifts in history and were entering a warmer, more hospitable period. Yet somewhere between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, the Clovis culture and most other ancient American cultures completely vanished. So let us take a moment to talk about what we do know about their disappearance and why it's one of the greatest mysteries in archaeology. But there's one thing archaeologists have never recovered: definitive proof of how these ancient Americans died out. See, when the world began to warm at the end of the Ice Age, the climate became drier and the environment shifted from tundra to grassland and desert. As temperatures rose, so did sea levels. Coastal groups watched as waves crept further inland, taking away land and forcing people to move further inland. Most importantly, though, the warming world brought an end to the Ice Age megafauna. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths went extinct. Disappearing from the fossil record around 12,900 years ago, it was an idea. Archaeologists call it a lithic culture, or more specifically a projectile point style. Lithic refers to stone tools, and projectile points are the kind of sharp handheld blades you would put in a spear or an arrow. Specifically, the Clovis people are named after the type of projectile points they made and left behind at archaeological sites. These points are distinctive because of their shape, size, material, and method of construction. They are usually between 2 and 3 inches long, with a leaf-shaped cross-section and a flute or groove that runs along one side. These grooves are key because they show us how the Clovis points were made, and use a hammerstone to chip away flakes from the edges until it was easier to work with. Then they could use a special tool called a punch, an anvil, to start chipping away at the point-S shape. The punch was a hard piece of wood or bone, and the anvil was a flat rock placed under the core to cushion the blow of the hammerstone, and that's where the flute came in. By hammering the core with the punch held against the anvil, the Clovis people could slowly carve a flute into the side of the core. Once complete, they would remove the finished projectile point and continue working the core until they had made several points worth of material. But despite their similarities, the Clovis culture wasn't a single society. See, making these projectile points wasn't easy. First, Clovis groups would find a large piece of rock called a core. These techniques weren't unique to any particular tribe, but because they spread so far in theory, this should have been a great time to be alive. First, let's talk about what happened to them. And this isn't just some random coincidence. All across the Americas, we see evidence of this extinction event reflected in the archaeological record. In fact, archaeological evidence shows that after about 13,000 years ago, Clovis people stopped hunting mammoths altogether. But then suddenly, around 13,000 years ago, the mammoths disappeared. And without this valuable resource, the Clovis way of life quickly fell apart. So here are the questions that scientists are trying to answer. For example, consider the megafauna extinction. When mammoths disappeared, it must have been devastating for the Clovis groups who relied on them for food, clothing, and shelter. Another popular theory blames drought. After all, the end of the Ice Age was a dry period in North America. Instead, we should focus on something that has the potential to affect everyone, plants, animals, and the environment. Thanks for watching.
The images are faded black and white, the kind that's usually reserved for historical photos more than a century old. But these are not more than a century old. They're barely 2 decades old, and they're fading into color before our eyes, which is strange because they were never colored to begin with. These photographs are from 1996. They show archaeologists carefully brushing dirt off ancient artifacts. One of them is holding up a distinctive stone spear point called a Clovis point, named after the town of Clovis in New Mexico, where one was first found in 1932. We see what they found, not just a single Clovis point this time, but 45 of them, plus thousands of other stone tools and animal bones. Thousands of years after the last Clovis hunter vanished, a discovery in New Mexico cracked open their forgotten world. Even though the collection had been found in a pile of dirt that wasn't properly excavated, several of the objects stood out, especially the spear points, and 14,500 years ago, putting them squarely in the middle of the last ice age. What's more, the finds at Blackwater Draw also included the remains of North American camels, horses, saber-toothed cats, if the projectile points are to be considered as imitations of some earlier type. It would seem logical that we should find a greater quantity of the supposed originals. If, however, a few 100,000 years of erosion have anything to say about it, such hopes are destined to disappointment. That might not sound like a big deal now, since we know perfectly well that our ancestors used bone tools, but at the time, no one was expecting to find bone needles, awls, and other tools used for sewing hides and making clothing. Scientists were beginning to think that the Clovis culture wasn't descended from the pre-Clovis people, but was descended from a mysterious and completely unknown culture. Some even began to question whether all the prehistory in North America could be explained by just one culture. Archaeologists continue to excavate sites across North America, but none of them were Clovis. Or if they were, no one cared. It was a term that indicated that a discovery was so mundane that it defied explanation. For 3/4 of a century, the idea of a rich, diverse prehistory in North America stayed buried. They might as well have been. Instead, scientists proposed that dozens of cultures had risen and fallen across the continent, each leaving behind its own stone tools, pottery, weapons, and other clues to their existence. They also found thousands of flakes of chipped stone, hammerstones, and other tools, plus hundreds of animal bones that came from at least 62 individuals. Instead, they probably traveled around with their bison kills and set up camp nearby. They were following the bison and other megafauna across the landscape, and they were unstaying in one place too long. Not only does this help explain how the Clovis culture could thrive for so long, it also means that the answer to the who, how, and why of the Clovis culture is somewhere out there in the archaeological record waiting to be discovered. At that time, the local environment was full of grass, shrubs, and trees, which they used for building materials, fuel, and food. It was warm and wet, like much of the American Southwest is today. But unlike today, the area wasn't isolated. Instead, it sat along a migration corridor used by herds of bison, camels, horses, and other large mammals, not to mention humans. And while the researchers were still analyzing the data, they felt confident that they had a pretty good picture of how the Clovis people lived. To get a better sense of the site's size, lead archaeologist Timothy Rowe compared it to the famous Cahokia site in Illinois. Cahokia contains the remains of about 60 mounds, the work of a culture that peaked in the 1200s. Blackwater Draw is about twice that size. Before the discovery in Montana, people hadn't been credited with inventing those technologies until about 5,000 years ago. Artifacts aren't going to leap out at archaeologists waving signs that say, "Hey, dig me up." If you'd like to help us make more videos like this, you can get started at our support page. Instead, it will look like more careful excavations, new technologies, and fresh ideas leading to new interpretations of old data. Because we don't need to discover the Clovis culture. We already have. We just need to remember that they exist. One of those structures was more than 100 feet wide and had at least 16 hearths, making it the largest structure ever identified at a Clovis Age site. Plus, they found bison bones that showed clear signs of butchery, meaning that the people who lived there were definitely hunting and eating the local megafauna. And with new techniques and fresh eyes, they found something nobody had seen before. Using a combination of ground-penetrating radar, magnetometers, and traditional shovels, they discovered that the artifacts weren't just lying around randomly. They'd been deposited in a layer of dirt only 2 feet below the surface. All the artifacts from the same time period were in the same place. But here was evidence that someone had been sewing animal skins together tens of thousands of years before. He was right, but not for the reason he thought. Maybe the pre-Clovis people migrated into North America from Asia over the Bering Strait land bridge, and then split up, with some continuing to hunt big game with stone tools, and others adopting a more varied toolkit that included bone. The technology that they developed may have survived in the artifacts used by Native American tribes living in the Great Plains. That's why the distinctive stone spear points that gave the Clovis culture their name might still be turning up today. Not because archaeologists keep finding them at sites from 14,000 years ago, but because modern hunters use them. Or maybe the two groups were related, with the pre-Clovis people emerging from the Clovis culture as they adopted new technologies and hunted smaller prey, and other iconic Ice Age creatures, all of which went extinct about 11,500 years ago. As far as archaeologists could tell, the Clovis culture seemed to have flourished alongside the very creatures they were hunting, but that shouldn't have been possible. According to the prevailing wisdom at the time, woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats had gone extinct more than 10,000 years before the Clovis culture appeared, and certainly no humans could have lived alongside them. By comparing the golly points to the arrowheads and other stone tools that archaeologists were already familiar with, they determined that the golly points were much older. Some scientists argued that the bones found at Blackwater Draw couldn't really be mammoth bones, even though they looked exactly like mammoth bones. They must have come from a species of dwarf elephant that hadn't been identified yet, or maybe from a different kind of extinct mammal entirely. That's because across the continent, archaeologists found more and more sites that seemed to have been occupied by the same people. Some, like the one at Blackwater Draw, contained stone tools. Others didn't. But the ones that didn't still contained bones of Ice Age megafauna, suggesting that whichever culture they belonged to definitely hunted big game. But without stone tools, they couldn't be classified as Paleo-Indians like the Clovis people were. So instead, scientists referred to them as pre-Clovis. Others argued that the spear points couldn't possibly be as old as the artifact suggested. After all, they didn't look much different from arrowheads used by Native Americans at the time, so they must have been crafted more recently by someone who copied the style from something they found at a site. Like Blackwater draw, they'd been crafted with a specialized technique that involved putting a lot of pressure on the tip of a stone tool and hitting the sides with a hammer stone until the edges are hollowed out to form a flute. That technique itself dated the artifacts as being between 12,500 and 13,500 years old, which pushed back the timeline for human history in North America by several thousand years. Sharp stone blades lay buried with the bones of mammoths, proof that humans hunted giants and that this culture once thrived. It's got a distinctive fluted design where the edges are hollowed out along the center. That collection formed the basis for what would become a famous pile of artifacts, now known as the Goler Group. After the original landowner, the collection included the first Clovis points ever found in North America. It wasn't the first time that these distinctive spear points had turned up. In fact, similar ones had been found in the American Southwest all the way back in the 1890s, but they'd been written off as arrowheads, or maybe just pieces of chipped stone. And that's probably what the Native Americans who made them intended as well, since they weren't exactly trying to start a prehistory. This particular one is only about 3 inches long, but it's razor sharp. The archaeologist in the photo isn't just holding it by the tip, she's holding it by the blade. You can see her fingers flexing where the stone meets the palm of her hand. That might not look like much now, but imagine seeing this for the first time nearly 100 years ago, when everything we thought we knew about human prehistory was wrong. This little rock fragment would have blown your mind. By the end of the 19th century, scientists believed that people hadn't been around long enough to make stone tools, let alone hunt giant mammals with them. Most of what they knew about the distant past came from Europe, where ancient tools and fossils were found mixed together in the same dirt. And they assumed that wherever humans were involved, there would also be crude stone tools and bones of small animals that had been hunted for food. So when paleontologists uncovered a skeleton of an extinct species of North American mammoth in the Badlands of New Mexico, they figured they'd found the proof that would finally put the idea of prehistoric humans to rest. How could humans have possibly been around when the Ice Age megafauna was still alive? And then the Clovis culture happened. Starting in the late 1920s, archaeologists unearthed a trove of ancient artifacts in New Mexico, including that first distinctive Clovis point. For the first time ever, they found evidence that humans had lived during the last Ice Age, and that they de-hunted large game. The trouble was, after a few decades of excavations at the site where those artifacts were found, known as Blackwater Draw, they didn't find any more. For a while, the scientific community couldn't agree on how, why, or even if Clovis people existed. Then the idea of a whole prehistoric culture died out, and with it, interest in the Clovis people. Now, almost a century later, archaeologists are going back to Blackwater Draw. And as we watch, they brush away the centuries of neglect. It was 1932 when the landowner decided to sell some of the bones that had been washing out of the banks of Blackwater Draw to a museum curator in Denver. But as soon as word got out about the Golly collection, archaeologists were on the case. In fact, dating techniques developed since the 1930s suggest that the Clovis culture dates to between 13,500, but here was proof that they did, which meant something else had to change. That kind of argument really rankled archaeologist J. Walter Fuchs, who led the excavations at Blackwater Draw from 1932 to 1934. In a 1933 paper, he wrote, over the next few decades, scientists stopped arguing about whether the Clovis culture existed and started arguing about whether it mattered. Then, in the 1970s, new discoveries in Montana turned things upside down again. There, archaeologists found a site with bone tools. That meant the pre-Clovis cultures might actually be Clovis in origin. But by the 1990s, that line of thinking had lost steam. What's more, scientists began to realize that the Clovis culture might not have disappeared after all. So by the time the black and white photos from the 1990s rolled around, the Clovis culture had gone from being a fascinating footnote in the history of human migration to a cultural boogeyman, a catch-all term for any prehistory that did unfit neatly into whatever current paradigm scientists had come up with. Until recently, funding dried up. Interest waned and Clovis became synonymous with boring. But in 2014, archaeologists went back to the pile of bones and artifacts that started it all, the Goler collection. And as they dug deeper, they realized that layer was only the tip of the iceberg. The site was much bigger than anyone had imagined. The researchers were able to identify 7 different areas within the site, each of which held the remains of dozens of structures, hearths and middens. The archaeological term for piles of discarded food, remains. All told, they found 45 Clovis points, including 2 that were fluted, hollowed out along both sides, demonstrating the sophisticated stoneworking technology that defined the Clovis culture. They built large communal structures and hunted large game, but they didn't live in those structures. As Tim Rose says, this really helped us understand the lifeways of the Clovis culture. With any luck, that discovery will happen sooner rather than later, but it won't look like what you're imagining. Thank you for watching this episode, which was brought to you with the help of our patrons.
This is the story of the Clovis, the most widespread ancient culture in North America before the Maya. This was an advanced civilization that lived in what today is the southwestern part of the United States. They developed their own language, their own religion, their own economy, their own art, and their own technology, including some that modern scientists still can't explain. But how did this highly advanced society suddenly appear in North America, and why do we still know so little about them today? Hi everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at the Clovis people. Let's get into it. Number 10. Across the ice. The Clovis people are named after the site where they were first discovered in New Mexico in 1932. At the time, archaeologists believed they had uncovered the remnants of an ancient settlement that dated back no further than 10,000 years. But in the decades since, dozens of other sites have been found from the same time period, all across the continent. In fact, evidence has been found that dates back as far as 13,000 years ago, and that raises a lot of questions. For example, how could these people have spread so far and so fast? How come we haven't found more sites between the first ones and the others? What happened to them after they disappeared? Most archaeologists believe that the Clovis people migrated from Siberia across the now defunct Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age. There is clear evidence that humans were living in Siberia 14,000 years ago, and when the glaciers covered North America, there was a land bridge that connected eastern Russia with Alaska and eventually the rest of the continent. However, recent studies suggest that the ice sheet actually created more of a dam than a bridge. You see, when the glaciers moved through the Rocky Mountains, they blocked the Columbia River, creating a gigantic lake called Glacial Lake Columbia. This massive body of water stretched all the way from the Gulf of Vancouver down to the Great Salt Lake in Utah. It may have even extended as far south as New Mexico. And according to research, the Clovis people may have used boats to navigate the lake. In fact, a study published in 2021 suggests that the Clovis likely traveled in large groups, bringing their culture and technology with them as they spread across the continent. This would also explain why they were able to settle so quickly. Rather than hunting and gathering, they would have brought domesticated animals with them, and would have been able to live off the land. Another theory suggests that they came to the Americas independently from multiple locations. However, this is less likely since they all seem to share the same cultural traits and material goods. Either way, by 13,000 years ago, the Clovis people were thriving from the Great Plains to the Pacific Northwest. The Black Sands. Some of the oldest Clovis sites can be found along the banks of the Black Sands River in Oregon. Here archaeologists discovered stone tools, projectile points, and a possible village site that may have been occupied as early as 12,800 years ago. It was here that the Clovers developed their distinctive style of spear points, which became known as fluted points or corner notch projectile points, due to the triangular notch cut into the base. These points were incredibly well crafted and were used for a variety of purposes. At the time, archaeologists believed that they were used for arrowheads, but now we believe they were more likely used in spears that were thrown from a distance. These fluted points were incredibly precise and perfectly symmetrical. They were usually made from high-quality materials like obsidian, chert, and chalcedony. In addition to being skilled craftsmen, the Clovis people were also skilled hunters. They hunted a variety of animals, including camels, horses, bison, mammoths, saber-tooth, cats, and dire wolves. Their preferred method of hunting was to use a spear to take down a large animal, and then use smaller tools to butcher it. Unfortunately, Most of the Clovis sites in Oregon have been destroyed due to flooding, erosion, and development. But the sites that remain continue to provide valuable insights into the lives of the Clovis people. No. 8. Mammoth hunters. If you ask any archaeologist what their favorite type of discovery is, they will undoubtedly answer mammoth bones. That's because over the past 2 decades, scientists have uncovered several Clovis sites that show clear evidence that they hunted and ate these prehistoric giants. For example, the Galt site in Texas was occupied by the Clovis for almost 1,000 years, between 13,000 and 12,000 BC. Here they built several structures, including the remains of what may have been the world's oldest house. They also left behind a variety of artifacts, including stone tools, animal bones, and even a piece of charcoal that was dated to 12,800 years ago. But perhaps the most exciting find at the Goa site was the discovery of a giant sinkhole filled with the bones of nearly 60 mammoths. This suggests that the Clovis may have used the sinkhole as a trap to catch the mammoths, or alternatively, they may have simply driven the animals into the hole. Either way, the Clovis people were clearly skilled hunters, who were not afraid to take on one of the largest mammals in the world, and they weren't done yet. A few hundred miles away in southeastern New Mexico, archaeologists discovered another Clovis site called the Blackwater Draw. Here they found even more evidence that the Clovis people were expert mammoth hunters. They uncovered a number of spear points and other tools that were likely used for hunting, as well as a number of butchered mammoth bones. In addition to hunting mammoths, the Clovis people also hunted a variety of other animals, including camels, horses, and bison. Number 7. The spread of the Clovis. From the deserts of Arizona to the forests of Nova Scotia, Clovis tools turned up everywhere. No single culture in ancient North America left such a wide and sudden mark. The Clovis were not just survivors, they were pioneers. By 12,500 BC, their descendants would stretch from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Circle. But just what exactly were they leaving behind? To answer that question, archaeologists have been hard at work excavating sites across North America, and what they've found is nothing short of amazing. For example, in Montana, archaeologists uncovered a Clovis site that contained the oldest undisputed evidence of human habitation in the state. The site also contained a number of artifacts, including stone tools, animal bones, and even a piece of charcoal that was dated to 12,500 years ago. In addition to these more typical finds, archaeologists also uncovered something much more rare, a human skull. This discovery provided an unprecedented opportunity to learn about the physical characteristics of the Clovis people. Other discoveries have been made in places as far away as Mexico and Florida. In fact, evidence of the Clovis culture has been found all over North America, suggesting that they were a truly widespread and influential people. But just why were they so widespread? And what happened to them after they disappeared? Number 6. Poverty point. One of the most interesting aspects of the Clovis culture is the fact that they seemingly appeared out of nowhere, and then disappeared just as quickly. We don't know much about their origins or why they suddenly showed up in North America, but we do know that their culture was highly advanced for the time period. They had a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy, as evidenced by the alignments of some of their structures with the cardinal directions. They also had a complex social structure, as evidenced by the size and complexity of their settlements. And they had a deep knowledge of the natural world, as evidenced by their ability to hunt large game, and their use of plants for medicine. So where did they come from, and what happened to them? One theory is that the Clovis were actually an ancient lost tribe of Israel. This theory is based on the fact that the Clovis culture bears a striking resemblance to the biblical account of the children of Israel. Both cultures were nomadic and traveled in large groups. They both had a strong emphasis on family and lineage, and they both seemed to have a deep knowledge of the stars. Of course, there is no direct evidence to support this theory, and it is likely that the Clovis people were Native Americans who evolved independently from earlier cultures, but it is an intriguing possibility nonetheless. Whatever the case may be, the Clovis people were a highly advanced and influential culture that left an indelible mark on North America. Their legacy lives on in the artifacts they left behind, and their story continues to captivate archaeologists and history buffs alike. Now, you're going to want to watch what actually happened to the Neanderthals, or check out another one of my videos. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you enjoyed it. Bye.
In this corner, weighing in at about 26,000 pounds, hailing from a small town in Texas, it's the Clovis culture. And in this corner, weighing in at about 14,000 years, also hailing from Texas, it's the pre-Clovis culture. Hi, it's me and welcome to Paleologic. Today we're going to settle once and for all who was first. The Clovis culture or the pre-Clovis culture? Just kidding. We're not going to do that because new discoveries are continuing to blur the lines between these two cultures, and what might have been a clear-cut case of one replacing the other may be turning into something more like a relay race where one team passes the baton to the next. Which brings us to our question of the day: was Clovis truly the first culture in North America, or were they just first found? Before we get into it, so when it comes to early human history in North America, there are some names you've probably heard before: Paleo-Indians, Archaic people, Woodland people, and yes, even Hopewell culture. But if you're hearing about any of those for the very first time today, don't worry, we've got you covered. Be sure to check out the description below for links to additional resources, including videos introducing each of those cultures. Alright, so let us go ahead and dive into the debate that has raged among archaeologists and paleoanthropologists since the mid-1930s. The debate over whether or not the Clovis culture was the first culture to inhabit North America, or whether there was a pre-Clovis culture that preceded them. The term Clovis culture refers to a group of people who lived in North America, roughly between 512, 800 years ago during the late Pleistocene epoch. They are named after the type site where their distinctive spear points were first discovered in 1932 near the town of Clovis in New Mexico. These distinctive spear points are called fluted projectile points because one side is grooved or fluted to make room for a long, thin blade, which means you need an anvil to shape the point and a hammerstone to sharpen the edges, meaning that the Clovis people had to quarry stone and knap those stones into tools, which suggests that they were a highly skilled people with advanced cognitive abilities. If you want to learn more about how projectile points are made, you should check out another video, which I'll link to below. The discovery of these projectile points in 1932 was pretty exciting for archaeologists at the time, because until then, the oldest artifacts ever found in North America were thought to date back only about 8,000 years. But at about 500 years old, the Clovis culture was older than anything ever found before. And because they were the oldest culture in North America that we knew of at the time, they became known as the first Americans. It didn't hurt that the official narrative at the time placed them as the ancestors of modern Native Americans, which made them kind of like the OG Americans. The Clovis culture flourished throughout much of North and South America, with sites ranging from Washington state all the way down to Mexico and into South America as far south as Chile and Argentina. But not everyone was convinced that they really were the first Americans. For example, in 1957, an archaeologist named J. Dunn Griffin excavated a site in Texas called the Goshen Site, which contained evidence of human occupation dating back 14,000 years. At the time, the cultural affiliation of those artifacts wasn't certain, but he suspected that they predated Clovis. Fast forward to the 1980s when another archaeologist, Michael R. Waters, excavated at the site and found several fluted points that appeared to be older than Clovis. Some scholars argued that the earlier fluted points weren't actually fluted points, that they were knives or scrapers instead. But Waters argued against that, saying that the beveling technique, which is the process of making a tool thinner towards the edge, was consistent across both the supposedly earlier and the later points, suggesting that they were the same tool made in the same way, regardless of who made them. And so scholars began to seriously consider the possibility that the Clovis culture was not the first culture to inhabit North America. Then, in 1998, the discovery of stone tools in Monte Verde, Chile, pushed back the timeline of human occupation in South America to at least 500 years ago, if not older, which suggested that humans arrived in South America before the end of the last ice age and therefore before the Clovis culture. In fact, a study published in 2020 argues that the Clovis culture should actually be dated to between 13 and 800 years ago, which would mean that they lived at the tail end of the last ice age, maybe even after the last glacial maximum, which occurred around 20,000 years ago. So what does this all mean? What it means is that if we continue to find evidence of human occupation before 13,000 years ago, we need to acknowledge that there was a culture in North and South America Before the Clovis culture, a culture that some are calling pre-Clovis. But here's the thing, every time we turn around, it seems like we're finding evidence of both cultures at the same time. For example, in 2015, researchers found a Clovis point at the site of Topper, which is in Allendale County, South Carolina. Now, Topper contains the earliest undisputed evidence of human occupation in the eastern United States, dating back approximately 14,500 years. So at Topper, researchers are finding both pre-Clovis and Clovis material, which means that the pre-Clovis people could have been contemporary with the Clovis culture. Or alternatively, the Clovis people could have replaced the pre-Clovis people. More recently in 2021, researchers announced the discovery of two new potential pre-Clovis sites in South America, one in northern Argentina and the other in southern Brazil. These two sites contain stone tools that appear to be older than Clovis and suggest that the pre-Clovis culture may have been widespread. But the very same year, a previously excavated site in southeastern Brazil was re-examined and revealed evidence of human occupation dating back to at least 13,500 years ago. Which means that if we continue to find evidence of human occupation before 13,500 years ago, we need to acknowledge that there was a culture in South America before the Clovis culture, a culture that some are calling pre-Clovis. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There is a lot of evidence that is emerging from all over the Americas that complicates the issue of who was first. For example, in 2022, archaeologists reported the discovery of bone fragments from extinct animals that had been butchered at a site in Texas known as the Galt Site. Now, the Galt Site dates back 15,500 years, making it potentially the oldest site in North America with evidence of human occupation. But at the Galt Site, researchers are finding both pre-Clovis and Clovis material, which means that the pre-Clovis people could have been contemporary with the Clovis culture. Or alternatively, the Clovis people could have replaced the pre-Clovis people. Another piece of evidence that complicates the issue of who was first comes from a paper published in 2023. The authors of that paper compiled and analyzed data from 37 previously excavated archaeological sites across North America, and they concluded that the oldest occupations at many of those sites were between 13,500 and 13,000 years ago, which is right around the beginning of the Clovis culture. But at the same time, they found evidence of younger occupations at many of those same sites that were associated with Clovis points, which means that the pre-Clovis people could have been contemporary with the Clovis culture. Or alternatively, the Clovis people could have replaced the pre-Clovis people. And just to complicate things further, recent research suggests that the pre-Clovis people may have inhabited coastal areas and used the shorelines as pathways to travel from place to place. This would mean that the pre-Clovis culture could have arrived in North America via boat and that they may have been maritime hunter-gatherers. This also means that there could be evidence of the pre-Clovis culture all along the coast that we haven't found yet. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that the issue of who was first is becoming increasingly complicated. It's possible that the Clovis culture was the first culture to inhabit North America, but more and more evidence is showing that this may not be the case. It's possible that there was a pre-Clovis culture that preceded the Clovis culture, but that culture may have lasted for thousands of years, meaning that there was a significant amount of overlap between the two. Or it's possible that neither of these groups was the first culture to inhabit North America. Instead, it's possible that there were multiple cultures living here before either of them, and that's just in North America. We've also got evidence of multiple cultures living in South America before either of them, and evidence is emerging from all over the Americas that complicates the issue, so it looks like the story of who was first is still being rewritten, and we will continue to bring you updates on this and other topics as new discoveries are made. Okay, that's it for this episode. Thank you all for watching. And once again, if you want to learn more about any of the topics discussed in this episode, be sure to check out the description below for links to additional resources, including videos introducing various Native American cultures. We've got videos about the archaic people, the woodland people, and the Hopewell culture. And if you haven't seen it yet, be sure to check out our latest episode, which introduces the Mississippian culture.
The story of the Clovis culture, first Americans of the Stone Age, a cultural legacy. In Episode 1, we discussed the discovery and significance of the Clovis culture, a prehistoric society known for its distinctive stone tool technology that dates back to about 13,500 years ago. But the story of the Clovis people doesn't end with their disappearance around 13,000 years ago. In fact, the legacy of the Clovis lives on in the oral histories and cultural practices of many Native American tribes, and their descendants continue to thrive across the United States today. Before we dive into this fascinating topic, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all located. I know there are thousands of tribal nations across Turtle Island, as North America is known by many indigenous peoples, and I don't want to misrepresent or disrespect any particular tribe. So I encourage you to look up the history of the land where you live and learn about the First Nations whose traditional territory it is. You can find resources to help you do this through websites and social media pages dedicated to this purpose. Now let's get started. Though the Clovis culture disappeared over 13,000 years ago, their legacy lives on in the oral histories and cultural practices of many Native American tribes. According to these traditions, the Clovis people were the ancestors of many modern Native Americans, and their distinctive stone tool technology continued to be used and revered for generations. It's important to note that not all tribes have stories that connect them directly to the Clovis, and the connection isn't always considered unbroken. For example, the Hopi do not identify with the ancestral Pueblones who built the Chaco Canyon Pueblos, despite living in close proximity to them and being impacted by their culture in various ways. And some tribes, like the Cherokee, have stories of their origins that predate the Clovis culture. However, many tribes do have stories and artifacts that connect them to the Clovis and earlier cultures, and they see themselves as the descendants of these ancient peoples. One way that Native American tribes have kept the memory of their ancestors alive is through oral storytelling. Many tribes have stories about the creation of the world, the origins of humanity, and the deeds of legendary heroes that have been passed down for generations. These stories often include references to ancient tools and technologies, such as the Clovis points. For example, the Navajo have a story about the emergence of the first people from the underworld, who were guided out of the darkness by a hero named First Man. First Man carried a spear made of a petrified palm wood and a knife made of obsidian, both of which are similar to the tools used by the Clovis people. The Navajo believed that these tools were gifts from the gods that enabled their ancestors to survive the journey out of the underworld and establish a new life on the surface. Another example is the Lakota, who have a story about a great flood that wiped out most of humanity, except for a small group of survivors. The story goes that after the flood, the survivors emerged from their hiding place and found the world transformed. They were given tools made of stone and bone to help them adapt to the new environment. And these tools were similar to those used by the Clovis and other pre-contact cultures. For the Lakota, these stories are more than just tales of the past. They are a way of connecting to their ancestors and understanding their place in the natural world. The stories teach important lessons about the importance of respect, responsibility, and the interconnectedness of all living things. They also serve as a reminder of the fragility of life and the need for humans to live in harmony with the environment. But oral traditions aren't the only way that the legacy of the Clovis and other ancient cultures is kept alive. Many Native American tribes have museums and cultural centers that display artifacts from their ancestors, including Clovis points and other stone tools. These artifacts are not just objects of historical interest, but are seen as powerful symbols of cultural identity and resilience. For example, the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., has a collection of Clovis points and other artifacts from various Native American cultures. These artifacts are displayed in a way that honors the traditions and perspectives of the tribes they represent. Visitors to the museum can learn about the history and significance of the artifacts and the cultures they come from, as well as the contributions of Native Americans to society as a whole. The Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center in Connecticut has an impressive collection of Native American artifacts, including a number of Clovis points. The museum's exhibits explore the history and culture of the Pequot people from their ancestral origins to the present day, and they highlight the importance of preserving cultural heritage and promoting understanding between cultures. In addition to museums, many Native American tribes have cultural centers and heritage sites that preserve and celebrate their traditions. These sites often feature archaeological sites, cultural exhibits, and educational programs that teach visitors about the history and culture of the tribe. For example, the Acama Pueblo in New Mexico is home to one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in the United States. The Acama people have lived here for over 1,000 years, and their culture and traditions are deeply rooted in the history of the region. The Acama Sky City Cultural Museum features artifacts from the Acama people and other indigenous cultures of the Southwest, as well as exhibits on the history of the area. The museum also has a gift shop that sells traditional Acama pottery and jewelry. The Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site in Illinois is home to the largest Native American city in the pre-Columbian Americas. The city flourished from about 800 to 1400 AD and was home to a large population of Native Americans. Today, visitors can explore the mounds and other archaeological sites at the park, as well as learn about the history and culture of the Native Americans who lived here. Despite the efforts of Native American tribes to preserve their cultural heritage, many artifacts from their ancestors, including Clovis points, have been lost or destroyed. Some artifacts have been stolen or smuggled out of the country, while others have been damaged due to neglect or vandalism. The loss of these artifacts is a tragedy for Native American communities, as they represent an important part of their cultural identity and history. In recent years, there have been efforts to repatriate stolen artifacts and protect sacred sites from vandalism. In 2013, the Smithsonian Institution returned a number of Native American artifacts, including a Clovis point, to the Zuni Pueblo tribe. The artifacts had been in the Smithsonian's collection for decades, but were finally returned to the Zuni Pueblo where they belong. Similarly, the National Park Service has worked to protect the Cahokia Mounds from vandalism and looting. In 2017, a man was arrested for stealing artifacts from the site, and in 2018, the National Park Service launched a campaign to raise awareness about the importance of protecting cultural resources. The efforts to preserve Native American artifacts and cultural sites are important not only for the tribes themselves, but for all Americans. As we learn more about the history and culture of Native Americans, we gain a deeper understanding of our shared heritage and the richness of American history. We also learn about the resilience and adaptability of Native American cultures, who have thrived despite centuries of persecution and cultural erasure. By preserving their artifacts and cultural sites, we ensure that future generations will have the opportunity to learn about and appreciate the contributions of Native Americans to our society and the beauty and diversity of our nation's cultures. We hope you enjoyed learning about the connection between the Clovis culture and modern Native American tribes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
In a world of giants, mammoths roamed the Great Plains 12,000 years ago. These prehistoric behemoths grazed on grasses that grew tall as men and thick as tree trunks. A land without trees, just endless grasslands stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean. A horizon broken only by the occasional butte or the distant snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Clovis people hunted these giants with spears as long as their bodies, tipped with blades fashioned from the hardest stone in the world, a material so durable that even today we can barely chip it with modern hammers. Their name, Clovis, comes from a place in New Mexico where archaeologists unearthed over 40,000 artifacts in one site, including 389 projectile points. The sheer number of these exquisitely crafted spearheads hints at the scale of their operation. The logistical feat of subsisting on the Great Plains, a place seemingly devoid of resources, this is what they left behind. In the museum, there's this one spearhead that I always come back to. It's cracked and covered in grit, but under the glass case, if you look closely, you can see how precisely it was worked. The concave curve of the flute, the grooves worn into the sides from thousands of skillful throws, and then its size. This point would have been attached to a spear 7 feet long. Imagine holding it in your hands, feeling its weight, the balance of it, the way it would stick out from the shaft like an outstretched hand begging for the sun. The Clovis culture thrived here for nearly 1,000 years until some unknown cataclysm caused them to abandon their homes. But what did they leave behind? Did they erase themselves from the landscape? Or are their bones still part of the ground beneath our feet? To answer that question, I came to a place that looks a lot like the setting of an old Western film. Endless golden grass rippling in the wind, the sky a pale blue above the brown earth. Only there are no cowboys here. There's nothing but sand and scrub brush and this, a sandstone monolith standing 18 feet tall, carved with images that may be 12,000 years old. But first, a little context. The Great Plains were once called the Great American Desert, and for good reason. Before Europeans arrived, most maps left the center of the continent blank because no one really knew what was there. There were no major rivers or identifiable landmarks, just an empty expanse of grassland that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was until explorers ventured into the region in the 1600s that they realized the Great Plains were actually home to hundreds of distinct cultures speaking dozens of languages. By the time European colonists arrived, most of those cultures had disappeared, leaving behind ghost towns made of stone and the wind-worn ruins of dwellings built from the hides of animals. The only record of their existence is what we found in the dirt, things like pottery shards, arrowheads, and tools, which scientists use to piece together their lifeways, and yet something about this place feels alive. The plains whisper stories of the past, and if you listen carefully, you can hear them. Like this place called Danger Cave, perched high atop a butte overlooking the valley below. Archaeologists found 15 layers of debris inside the cave, each layer representing a new inhabitant who returned to this spot over and over again. Scattered among the trash were pieces of bone from deer, antelope, bison, and prehistoric camels. All around us are the remains of plants, seeds, and fruit pits from sunflowers, walnuts, pecans, and plums. Danger Cave was probably used as a base camp, a place where people came to butcher animals, share food, and stay safe from predators. We don't know if the Clovis were the first to use this cave, but they almost certainly did. Here in the archaeological layers, scientists found flakes of stone that were chipped off during the creation of projectile points. They also uncovered bone tools, awls, scrapers, knives, and spatulas. Some were hafted, meaning they would have been attached to handles. Others were detached and used freehand. These tools wouldn't have been useful for hunting megafauna, though. They were much too small. Instead, the evidence suggests that the Clovis traded with other groups, bartering goods made from bone and stone in exchange for meat. But why trade when you can just take it? About 5 miles south of Danger Cave is a site called Blackwater Draw. Here, archaeologists unearthed the bones of over 500 mastodons, along with tools and enough animal bones to feed a community for years. They estimate that the Clovis brought down between 200 and 500 mastodons per year, killing them with spears and knives before stripping their bodies and throwing the leftovers back to the scavengers. I spent some time walking around the site, taking in the scale of what the Clovis accomplished. I mean, look at this thing. You can tell just from the shape of its tusks that it was huge. And yet they brought it down. I stood next to its skeleton, imagining the force of the spear as it plunged into the beast's side. Did this creature suffer? How long did it live after it was wounded? Did it stampede, trampling the grasslands and sending up a cloud of dust? Was its blood red or was it black like tar? Would it have tasted like beef or pork, or was it gamey and unpleasant? What did they do with its skin? Did they use it as a blanket or clothing? Could it be dried and eaten months later? What about its bones? Did they make tools from them? Did they use them to build their houses, or did they throw them away? There are more questions than answers, of course, but the truth is, the Clovis were gone long before Europeans arrived. They vanished from the archaeological record around 11,500 years ago, leaving behind nothing but stone tools and a handful of bone fragments. It's not clear why they disappeared. Perhaps it was climate change. Maybe the glaciers were coming back, forcing them to flee. Or maybe it was something they brought upon themselves. One theory holds that the Clovis overhunted, that they killed off so many mastodons and other large mammals that the ecosystem collapsed. Whatever happened, they left the plains and never looked back. For thousands of years, scientists thought that they disappeared completely until the early 1930s, when an amateur archaeologist named J. Walter Fuchs discovered an ancient site near the Canadian border. It was filled with Clovis artifacts, including 35 perfectly preserved spear points. This site, called Angostura, proved the Clovis people had survived for another 500 years after abandoning the southernmost parts of the Great Plains. But where did they go? Most researchers believe that the Clovis migrated north and east, following herds of reindeer and bison into the heart of North America. Some scholars disagree, pointing out that there isn't much physical evidence to support this theory. We haven't found any Clovis sites in the eastern United States, only a few stray projectile points. I think that's because they took something with them when they left the plains. Take a look at this spearhead. See how it's grooved here and here? Now imagine a line running through the center of it, dividing it in two. If you were to stack these two halves, one on top of the other, you'd end up with a weapon that looked kind of like this. A two-pronged spear thrower, also called an atlatl. Atlatls don't preserve well. They're usually made from wood or bone, materials that break down over time. But every now and then, archaeologists will find a piece of rock that someone has chipped into the shape of an atlatl weight. We don't know exactly how atlatls work, but we have a pretty good idea. Unlike regular spears, which require a lot of strength to hurl through the air, atlatls extend the thrower's arm, increasing speed and range. Some atlatls were simple. They consisted of a dart and a weighted hook that fit over the end of the shaft. Others were more complex, with a groove that ran along the length of the dart. These allowed the user to guide the projectile through the air, improving accuracy. Clovis spear throwers weren't just tools. They were works of art. Someone made this one from a piece of quartz, the size of a man's fist, chipping and grinding it until it was smooth and even. Then they wrapped the two halves in sinew and sealed them together with resin. Next, they drilled a hole through the center and attached a leash. Finally, they polished the quartz until it gleamed like obsidian. When this hunter grasped his atlatl, he wasn't just holding a tool, he was holding a piece of himself. Every time he threw a spear, he was casting a piece of himself into the world. The spear was an extension of his body, a conduit for his will. When the Clovis left the Great Plains, they took their spear throwers with them, along with their knowledge of the land and their ability to hunt big game. But what about everything they left behind? The bones and the blood and the stuff in the ground? The answer to that question can be found in a place called Blackwater Wash. This site is near the Canadian border, hidden away in a remote part of the Oklahoma Panhandle. Back in the 1970s, archaeologists unearthed 4,000 years' worth of history in this one place. They uncovered projectile points from the Paleo-Indian period, tools from the Archaic period, ceramics from the Woodland period, and even a burial from the Mississippian period. These people were all different, and yet they all lived in this one place. Why? Because it was special. To the Clovis, it was a resource, a place where they could hunt, fish, and gather plants. To the Native Americans who buried their dead here, it was sacred. As I stand in the archaeological site, surrounded by centuries of history, I feel a deep sense of connection. I'm standing on the bones of giants, both literally and figuratively. The Clovis were some of the first people to ever set foot in North America, and their legacy lives on in the Native American tribes who followed them. So what did they leave behind? Well, not much. The Clovis didn't leave behind temples or pyramids or giant statues. They left behind stone, shaped by hand, lying where it fell. That is the legacy of the Clovis, a brief flame in time, but one that still flickers in the heart of the continent's story.
Hello and welcome to this channel. It's 5:30 a.m. on the Blackwater Draw archaeological site near Portales, New Mexico. And I'm sitting here watching the sun come up over the dig site. It's another beautiful day in the desert. The wind is gently blowing across the grass. Out in the distance, I can see some pronghorns. And just beyond them, there's the telltale flash of a roadrunner running through the scrub. This is one of my favorite places on Earth, and right now it's being worked by archaeologists from Eastern New Mexico University. They've been digging here for 2 weeks, and they were getting ready to wrap up their field season. In the middle of this dig site, there's an area that we call the ring. It's not really a ring, but when we look down into it, we think of like a bird's eye view of an aerial photograph of England with all those little rings of houses and villages around it. This particular ring is made up of about a dozen individual encampments from between about 12,000 and 13,000 years ago during the late Pleistocene epoch, shortly before the end of the Ice Age. Here in the southern Great Plains, the end of the Ice Age was a time of tremendous environmental change. The climate got warmer and drier, the glaciers melted, sea levels rose. And as the land began to dry out, forests became grasslands and small animals like mastodons and saber-toothed cats went extinct. The people who lived here, however, adapted and survived. These are the Clovis culture, America's first known prehistoric hunters. We know them only from their signature projectile points, which are found all over North America, including here in the southern Great Plains. We call them Clovis because the type site where the first ones were found is named Clovis, New Mexico. It's near the town of Maxwell, just south of the Canadian border. What makes Clovis points unique is that they're fluted, meaning that there's a groove that runs down one side and along the base of the point. That groove is made by carefully chipping away at the stone, carefully flaking it so you don't damage the tip of the point. But what was that point used for? Well, as far as archaeologists can tell, they were used for hunting large game, especially mammoths. During the late Pleistocene, the southern Great Plains was a mammoth migration corridor. That means that every year they would move north to Canada to spend the summers, and then they demigrate back south for the winters. Every year, generation after generation, they followed the same route right here through eastern New Mexico, so the people of Clovis followed them. Clovis points were placed in spears or darts and likely used by well-trained hunters to take down these mammoths and other large animals. And while the hunters ran after the wounded beasts, their dogs ran alongside them, helping to bring the mammoths down. In fact, dogs were present with the Clovis throughout their entire range and may have played an important role in their success as hunters. But it wasn't just mammoths that these people hunted. Other species of animals that they exploited included camels, horses, bison, and a kind of prehistoric tapir called a mastodon. All told, they were hunting some of the largest animals in North America. And given the kind of prey that they were pursuing, it's easy to see why their settlements would be scattered across the landscape. They didn't live in one place for very long because they were always following the herds. Just like the animals they pursued, the Clovis were constantly moving. At sites like Blackwater Draw, they stayed for a few weeks or months, maybe a year or two. Then they packed up and moved somewhere else. That's also why we don't find a lot of their stuff. Unlike later cultures, the Clovis rarely buried things. When they left a site, they took everything with them. You lines never find a piece of pottery or a stone tool or even a bone needle at a Clovis site because they weren't making those things. They were hunters, and they only left behind the things that they needed for hunting, things like their stone tools and animal bones for making more tools and animal hides for making clothing. For thousands of years, Blackwater Draw was thought to be the oldest site in North America. For a long time, the idea that the Clovis were America's first inhabitants went unquestioned. And that's because the earliest sites like Blackwater Draw were dated to about 12,500 years ago. But recent discoveries have pushed back the timeline for human occupation in North America at least 1,000 years before that. The earliest sites date to about 14,500 years ago, and some go back as far as 16,000 years ago. And some archaeologists think that humans could have arrived in North America even earlier than that. So who were these first Americans? Well, based on the genetic evidence, the ancestors of the Clovis came to the Americas about 15,000 years ago during the height of the last ice age. This was a time when much of the world's population was concentrated in East Asia. As the glaciers expanded, people migrated into Central Asia and eventually into the newly glaciated areas of North America. Over the course of a few thousand years, these people would evolve into the Clovis culture. Their territory stretched from the central Great Plains to the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia, as well as into Mexico. But despite their vast territory, we have very little information about them. Even their name isn't really theirs. It's a term that archaeologists coined. There's no written record of what they called themselves, and what do we know about their lives? Well, we know that they had a deep knowledge of the animals they hunted. They tracked them, read their signs, knew when and where they would travel. And they probably observed their behavior and learned how to use the terrain to their advantage. When it comes to their technology, the Clovis developed some of the most sophisticated stone tools of their time. They chose high-quality materials like high-quality chert and obsidian, and they used hammers, anvils, and other tools to chip and shape them into knives, scrapers, and spear points. They probably also used bone tools to process hides and wood, but so far, archaeologists haven't discovered any bone needles or other bone tools in good condition. Based on similar tools from later pre-contact cultures, however, we know that they likely made them. We also know that the Clovis kept dogs. Not only does the archaeological record show that they had dogs, but studies of ancient DNA suggest that modern dogs are descended from the dogs that the Clovis kept. Finally, we know that the Clovis had the courage and skill to hunt the largest animals in North America. They ventured out onto the open plains and took on bison, mastodons, camels, and mammoths. They were explorers, survivors, hunters. They were the first Americans. And today, right here at Blackwater Draw, we're learning what life was like for them 12,000 years ago. We're relearning what it was like to be a hunter-gatherer in the heart of the southern Great Plains. Now the excavations here at Blackwater Draw won't be returning next year. It is a big undertaking to get a research project going, and funding can be hard to come by. But don't worry, the work will continue here. Archaeologists from the University of Texas at Austin will be taking over the project, and they lines be excavating new areas of the site. Who knows what they might find? Maybe another ring of houses, maybe even something older than the Clovis. After all, Blackwater Draw has been occupied for more than 10,000 years, and most of that time has been lost to history. It's 7:30 a.m. now. The sun is rising higher in the sky, and soon the heat will start to build over the dig site. It's been an amazing 2 weeks. We've learned a lot about the Clovis, and we've made some pretty exciting discoveries. But it's time for me to go. There's still a lot more work to be done, but that's for another day. For now, it's time to head home. Long before cities, before nations, before even the first legend, there were the Clovis. Hunters, explorers, survivors, the first Americans of the Stone Age, thank you for coming on this journey with us as we explore the world of the Clovis. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more journeys into the distant past. Until next time, this is the host.